changing, I can't stand it. My heart can't take this damage. And the way I feel, can't stand it. Baby, I don't understand it. We're changing, I can't stand it. My heart can't take this damage. And the way I feel, can't stand it. Baby, I don't understand it. We're changing, I can't stand it. My heart can't take this damage. And the way I feel, can't stand it. Baby, I don't understand it. I don't understand it. I don't understand it. Girl, you're making it hard for me. Girl, you're making it hard for me. Girl, you're making it hard for me.
Forming coherent thoughts on a number of subjects. But thoughts of death shatter me entirely. I am helpless. I am horrified. I realize that in the words of Leo Tolstoy, as I live, I am being stuffed into a big, dark sack. My warmest memories appear and immediately rush back into the past. The smell of the Atlantic springtime, picking blackberries with my mother, running through the garden and catching fireflies in jars. These memories I love so much become only reminders that one day I must die. And suddenly every year is passing more quickly than the last. This dread comes from the unknowable and unstoppable nature of death. Why do we die? What does death mean? If we die, why do we live? These questions are perhaps the most well-trodden of all. History's greatest thinkers have pondered over death. The wisest, most talented humans our Earth has ever produced have attempted to tackle this subject. Yet, they have all failed. But why? Where do I go from here? As far as I can tell, there are two places we can seek an answer to death: man and nature. Man presents us with science, and in the subject of death, science offers a white flag in a war. Science can tell us the biomechanical, physiological realities of death. It can tell us what happens to your body when you die and how your body then decays. While academically interesting, this does little to bring clarity to death. It does nothing to help a person make peace with dying. So I find the world's greatest scientists rendered somehow into uselessness. Moving past science, we can look elsewhere. Spiritualists, philosophers, whoever, they've all examined death. I've read many of them. The might of all of this intellectual force has been hurled at death time and time again. I still find no answers. Lots of questions, but no answers. And surely I can expect nothing more. People are writing about things they know nothing about. When they so beautifully theorized about death, they had not died. They were as ignorant then as I am now. These writings are window dressing. Beautiful, but ultimately without function in the face of death. I'm being shoved into a sack. Do I want it to have spots or stripes? Of course, there's also God, religion, man's greatest shield against the reality of death. I have a deep admiration for the religious. To have such faith, such conviction in a storm of arguments to the contrary. I believe this requires a tremendous and unique strength of character. But like so many, I cannot bring myself to believe in God. I'd like to believe in God, but I'm not strong enough. I cannot look at the world around us, even with all of its beauty, and take seriously the idea of God. What God gives a child cancer? What God sends hurricanes to the poor? No God of mine. Religion can have no place in my conversation with death. Without other solutions, I often look to nature. Here we have vultures, hyenas, insects. These creatures all thrive off the deaths of others. In nature, animals die and leave opportunities for the other members of their ecosystem. I do find beauty in this phenomenon. How could a person not? I wish this could provide me with some great comfort. But I still find myself running into that same concrete wall. The conclusion of nature does nothing to abate the paralyzing feeling I get when I think about death. You see, reason and hope become grotesquely meaningless when posed with these questions. The truth that I know with all of my body, is that there can be no answer. In fact, the only answer is the hopelessness I feel when I think about death. And so all I can do is live. The only thing I can find that is an approximation of an answer to this dilemma is just that, life. How can a person really live with death looming over everything at the end of every day? Many philosophers and authors have discussed this question. Unlike their conversations of death, their conversations of life in the face of death can provide some earnest direction. In 1879, Leo Tolstoy had published War and Peace as well as Anna Karenina. He had earned his place among world literature, hailed as a genius. After being born into wealth, Tolstoy had become famous for doing what he loved the most, and yet he felt entirely unfulfilled. Promise of achievement had been broken. Tolstoy was spiritually, emotionally lost, despite a life that should have produced the opposite. It was in this state that he wrote The Confession. This roughly 100-page essay outlined his quest to find the meaning of life, and specifically the deep depression that he fell into upon concluding that life was meaningless. It discusses melancholy, suicide, depression, and misery. It is one of the most heartbreaking, arresting essays ever put to paper. And in these pages, I have found my only comfort. Tolstoy begins with his decreasing interest and belief in religion. He says that he only believed in God because his elders had instructed him to, and even then, the belief had been shaky. Throughout Tolstoy's early years, perhaps his truer religion had been art. He sought fulfillment in his art, poetry, writing, and in the circles of geniuses that he associated with. Tolstoy had once held a great faith in the arts, but it was one that began to wane. The people in his circle, including himself, were paid and praised highly for their work. The public said they were arbiters of profound ultimate truths, that these artists were enlightening the world. The artists themselves believed it. How could they not? But Tolstoy eventually realized that for every great writer's idea, there would be another who wholly disagreed with it. So he wondered how any of these people could really be arbiters of truth if they themselves didn't even agree on this truth. Tolstoy observed that his peers simply hung out with people who praised them and rejected those who didn't. So every artist believed themselves to be correct. His faith in the arts as a driver of meaning crumbled. Instead, he began to look at the concept of progress. Live to make progress. Within progress, one could find fulfillment, Tolstoy believed. He would have a family, create a wondrous life, and just make progress. But years into this, Tolstoy traveled to Paris. There he witnessed a public execution. As the prisoner's head fell into its box, Tolstoy began to question this concept of progress. This disillusionment continued with the death of Tolstoy's brother, Nikolai. He was a kind and intelligent man when he fell ill in his mid-20s. Nikolai suffered for over a year, eventually succumbing to an agonizing death from consumption. By Tolstoy's estimation, Nikolai never understood why he lived, why he suffered, nor why he died. In the face of this reality, what good was progress? But still clinging to this idea of progress, Tolstoy began to teach young peasants in Russia. However, he quickly realized this was futile. Tolstoy himself did not have what they needed to learn. Whatever knowledge would have improved their lives, provided them fulfillment, Tolstoy himself could not identify and didn't even have. So his teaching became an impossible task. These experiences all crystallized in a deep, dark time of depression for Leo Tolstoy. In Confession, he says this about his pursuit of progress. I still had not understood that in answering that one must live according to progress, was talking just like a person being carried along in a boat by the waves and the wind. Such a person replies to the only important question, where do we steer, by saying, we are being carried somewhere. Tolstoy had always thought the meaning of life and death would come to him, that he would find it eventually. But now it became clear this wasn't going to happen. These questions came up over and over in his mind. In the Confession, he compares them to tiny black points. They were few and far between initially, but were coming together to form a single, unignorable, dark stain. They were, he said, like an illness ignored by a patient. The symptoms occurred with increasing frequency until they turned into one continuous duration of suffering. Suddenly, the patient would discover the truth. What was once a mild illness had now become death. Tolstoy was a famous intellectual. He had access to the greatest knowledge history had ever produced. No library would refuse him entry. He could sit down and have conversations with the wisest men in the world, and so he did. But through all of this, Tolstoy found no answers. He was instead overtaken with an intense depression. His thoughts turned to suicide, and these suicidal ideations became as normal to him as self-preservation once had been. To end his life felt as natural as eating or sleeping. To prevent himself from taking his own life, Tolstoy removed all the ropes from his room. He stopped hunting with a gun. In the confession, Tolstoy likened this time to having climbed a mountain. He was as successful as he could have ever been. He had reached the summit, expecting a wondrous view. Instead, he stood there like a fool, having found only an empty wasteland. In time, Tolstoy found himself with a new conclusion. Not that he didn't have the answers to life and death, but instead that these questions simply didn't have answers. In the confession, Tolstoy concludes that there are 4 ways to live a life, at least for a man in his class. First was ignorance. Some people, for whatever reason, had never been bothered by these questions. Tolstoy's thoughts here were simple. Once you start thinking about these things, you can't unthink them. There's no going back. So there wasn't anything he could learn from the ignorant. Second, he said, was Epicureanism. He defines this idea as being aware of one's impending death and its consequences, but enjoying life anyways. Points to the words of the biblical figure King Solomon. Do whatever you can do by the strength of your hand, for there is no work in the grave where you are going, no reflection, no knowledge, no wisdom. Tolstoy writes that most people employ this method, but he points to it as being inherently immoral. He says that these people lead lives where they experience more good things than bad, but through a moral stupidity, they forget that all of their advantages, privileges, and allowances are pure luck, just happen to be born into a good situation. He says that they forget not everyone can be a King Solomon with his palaces, his women, and his money. For every palace, there are 1,000 men who built it. The same chance that turns a man into a Solomon one day can turn him into one of Solomon's slaves the next. Tolstoy says that these people have a dullness of imagination that allows them to forget death, to forget that death will eventually just destroy the things they enjoy so much. He claims Epicureans aren't really much different than the ignorant. You see, once a person is illuminated to the moral problems with this lifestyle, there's again no going back. So ultimately, Tolstoy finds no comfort in Epicureanism. The third choice he proposes is suicide. If you don't like a room, then leave, Tolstoy declares. However, he says he is too emotionally weak to do this. The final option is where I find comfort, and it seems Tolstoy found some version of comfort as well. That option is simply to live. To recognize that everything will be destroyed eventually and that you will die eventually, but to keep moving forward. No matter how painful or inane or seemingly pointless death renders things to be, just keep living. Now, Tolstoy wrote this essay in the midst of a profound depression, and so he concludes that option 4 is wholly miserable. However, I have to disagree. I don't choose to disagree. I have to. I have no choice. I have no interest in suicide. I have no way of understanding death. This question will be forever unanswered. So all that I can do is find fulfillment in life and a meaningful connection to the act of living. This house may be destroyed in time, but I must still live in it. So I should make it nice. And so when I torment myself with imaginations of death, I have to think about this. I have to seek fulfillment in the mundane, in the everyday. I cannot dwell on the future. Friends, family, work, leisure, these are the things that make up my life, however futile they are when pitted against death. Indeed, the alternative is horrific. To let death lead one's life entirely astray. To ignore the issues of death and to lead a wholly unexamined life. This is an entirely different form of self-destruction. Perhaps appropriately, this is a subject Tolstoy examined in other work. The death of Ivan Ilyich is a fantastic companion piece to the confession, whether or not it was intended as such. It tells the story of Ivan Ilyich, a court official who falls and injures himself while hanging curtains in his home. The pain grows until a physician informs Ivan that the injury is terminal and he will die. The novella tells the story of Ivan's death. In fact, it opens with his funeral. From the first pages, the reader is assured that nothing will come save Ivan Ilyich, that the book does not end with some miracle. Ivan Ilyich spent his life as basically a social climber and a careerist. On his deathbed, he learns the consequences of this life. As Ivan lies dying, he remembers a passage he studied in school. Caius is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Caius is mortal. Slowly, Ivan realizes that he has ignored death, and instead he has lived a profound lie, an existence with no examination of death. Like a school child who breaks down when faced with punishment, Ivan's lie also crumbles as death becomes imminent. He has concealed death from himself, and thereby concealed life as well. Ivan, in the early stages of his infliction, wants only to live how he used to go back to when things were pleasant before this whole mess. So he begins to reflect on these pleasantries. But as he lays in his bed dying, Ivan realizes they all feel quite different. He says these pleasantries are melting into insignificance, all of them, except for the earliest recollections of his childhood. Of course, it was during these years that Ivan was unaffected by formal ideas of pleasantness or societal expectations. It occurs to Ivan that perhaps he did not live his life correctly. But he asks, how can that be? I did everything that was demanded of me. And in this question, Ivan is presented with the truth. He lived his entire life to fulfill the whims of others, in some cases in the micro sense, his employers or co-workers. In others, more grand, the expectations and ambitions that culture imposed on him, things that he fell for: wealth, status, adornment. As early as his schooling days, Ivan says he committed acts that he found abhorrent that inspired in him a sense of self-hatred. But by his colleagues, these acts were considered to be normal and admirable. Eventually, Ivan himself became one of those colleagues. These abhorrent acts likewise became normal and even aspirational by virtue of other people's expectations. So his life met all of these expectations. It earned him the approval and admiration of these people and institutions. But Tolstoy writes that Ivan's chief agony, one that even the opium could not solve, was this feeling. What if his whole life Ivan had not been doing the right thing? Eventually, Ivan cedes to this question and its inevitable answer. Unfortunately, all of his decisions have already inflicted their damage. On his deathbed, Ivan is truly alone, profoundly alone, in a way unbeholden to the physical presence of other humans. Tolstoy writes that Ivan feels a loneliness among his acquaintances and family, people who he had believed to be his loved ones, but perhaps are not. Ivan's loneliness, Tolstoy says, is fuller than any that can exist on earth, from the bottom of the sea or in the ground itself. Ivan's death, because of the way he lived, becomes an experience of isolation. And so at his deathbed, he is surrounded only by the most shallow version of company. In one passage, Ivan wants nothing more than to cry, to weep, and for someone to pity him as he lies in his excruciatingly painful death. He wants someone to cry with him, to comfort him as if he were a child. This is all that he wants with every fiber of his being. And then would in come one of his colleagues, asking only for a ruling on a legal matter. You see, all around him, Ivan saw people who were lying. They were basically pretending he wasn't actually dying. Tolstoy writes, this lie all around him and inside him, more than anything, poisoned the last days of Ivan Ilyич's life. When death finally arrives for Ivan, he begs his family for forgiveness. He cries and pleads. Only in this does he then die in peace. But Ivan's funeral reveals the depravity of his life in one final and horrifically triumphant blow. The attendees do not mourn or cry, but rather they express pure selfishness. Some think of the promotions they may win now that he's died. Others consider what amounts of money they could inherit. Still more people seem entirely annoyed by the whole thing, annoyed by the tedium of the tasks they must now perform. Broadly, these attendees are filled with a subdued joy that it is Ivan who has died, not them. The death of Ivan Ilyich tells us that a life poorly lived only serves to amplify the horrors of death, or perhaps create them entirely. And so I believe the answer to death is not found in what happens after or during, or even why we all must die, but instead in how we live. I was raised, along with my sister, by a single mother through early childhood. She worked a lot, as one must, to support 2 children, so my grandmother often took care of me in my mother's absence. Most days after school saw my grandmother, as did weekends and most of the summers. 2020, my grandmother had a stroke at the age of 93. She went to the hospital, largely not herself, physically or mentally. That night she suffered another stroke and a heart attack. Having signed a do not resuscitate order, my grandmother died that night in the hospital. She was accompanied by her husband of some 70 years. In my 20s, my relationship with my grandmother had deteriorated some, just by virtue of distance. I'd moved to a new city 1,000 miles away, but we still spoke on the phone here and there. The last thing my grandmother ever said to me was this: "People like to say life is short. Don't listen to them. Life is long." I think death can be a lot of things. It can be an enemy, a pair of shackles, a companion, or something else entirely. My dread will never go away. I will never have answers to the question of death. I will still lie in bed and think about dying, with regularity, likely for the rest of my life. I dare not delude myself with ideas of legacy. All people die. Some just take longer. But my hopes are twofold. First, that I can be ready for death somehow when it comes. And second, that in the meantime, I can live. That I can find true joy in all that entails. Indeed, I believe I have plenty of time to do so. Inheritances is equally treacherous. How then would he? Check out the Horses store at horses.land. There's a story this video south side of Chicago. Years ago, one winter, I was living on the south side of Chicago and working in the city's downtown area. As I walked into the underground train station one night, I saw a man sitting on the floor. He was homeless, a fact which is so tragically unremarkable that I may not even need to mention it at all. In front of him, on the ground, there was a long, round, dark object. It was all black as the asphalt above us. Hovering over the man was another individual, dressed in a doctor's uniform, carrying a bag. My best guess was that he was on the way home from his job at some medical facility. The doctor was imploring the man on the ground, who was unresponsive, to go to the emergency room, that if he didn't get to the hospital he would die. This elicited no verbal response from the man on the ground. In fact, he didn't even move. The doctor gave up pretty quickly. He had a train to catch. And as I got closer, it became more clear what the object on the ground was. Or rather, that it was not an object at all. It was the man's bare leg, rotting and matte black from his ankle to his knee. The leg was so swollen, so ballooned, that it lacked the contours human anatomy should have given it. It looked dry and brittle. I couldn't help but imagine pushing my finger through his limb and feeling it crumble. If I did this, I further imagined I would find some purple-gray liquid that was not at all what a human leg should contain. Of course, I didn't do this. I walked by the man, hypnotized by this rotten limb, not understanding how something so dead could be attached to a living person. The city of Chicago, in all of its intelligence, had deemed this issue to be undeserving of attention. Dozens of passers-by just passed him by. I did the same. American humanity had assembled all of its mental, spiritual, and economic power to create the shining city of Chicago. The city was a metropolis, a beacon of human technological achievement, progress crystallized by concrete and rebar. And yet it all seemed to add up to this. A human rotting on the ground, passed by because we all just had trains to catch. I didn't understand how this could be. I know that this incident in itself is just that, an incident, a specific problem with its own mechanical solutions, but perhaps I am just not a mechanical person. So it began within me a long, slow disillusionment with metropolitan life and by association even with the modern notion of progress. I'd like to talk about that now. Henry David Thoreau was a 19th century writer and leader of the Transcendentalist movement. Aside from its being as a religious movement, this school of thought believed in the inherent goodness of nature and humanity. Transcendentalists, though, noted that modern systems and technologies had spoiled this goodness. To be more immediate, Thoreau is famous for his work Walden. In 1845, Thoreau moved to a small, isolated cabin in the forest around Walden Pond, Massachusetts. Thoreau lived there for 2 years, eventually producing the book Walden based on his experiences. For the author, this was an experiment in simple living. He observed that rather than deliberate living, most people simply accepted that life was a series of waking up, working, going to bed, and repeating. He noted that this was not really by any fault of the individual. Thoreau writes, "When we consider what are the true necessities and means of life, it appears as if men had deliberately chosen the common mode of living because they preferred it to any other. Yet they honestly think there is no choice left." People's values were chosen for them by the culture into which they were born. The modern world did not offer sufficient time or space for an individual to arrive at their own conclusions about life. It was financially, materially impossible to engage in this self-examination. A person was just too busy. So instead, the world forced judgments onto a person. It told each individual what was important. And the person, more often than not, accepted those judgments, whether or not they felt any innate attraction to them. The result of this passive value acceptance had been, Thoreau noted, a culture of rampant but somehow passive materialism. Indeed, today we seek happiness in riches because the world has told us that is where happiness is to be found. In reality, we will never find happiness in these things. They are distractions from discovering true internal fulfillment. Thoreau points to a farmer who has inherited a barn, cattle, and farm tools. This circumstance could be celebrated. The farmer now had a means to make a living. But in reality, these things were not gifts to the farmer. They were burdens and they were obligations thrust onto him by powers far outside of his own. Thoreau suggests that if the farmer had been born into the wild, suckled by a wolf, he may have been better off. He may have been free to find his own pasture, his own calling. You see, upkeeping the farm does not just cost the farmer money, it costs toil and trouble, it costs time. Time that could be used to explore what the farmer himself actually wanted and valued. The farm costs life, and so the farmer from birth is born to dig his crops and also his grave. But to abandon these inheritances is equally treacherous. How then would he make a living? As far as I can tell, such is our modern version of humanity. We have all inherited this farm of technology, the crops of our systems, the implements of trade, banking, and commerce. In one breath, we thank the skies for such a prosperous world, while not recognizing that this so-called prosperity is also a vampire. It truly drains our lives. It forces our hand, forces us to exist within its never-ending loop. And just like the farmer, to abandon these things would destroy our civilization. Thoreau notes that most men, even in this comparatively free country, through mere ignorance and mistake, are so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. Their fingers from excessive toil are too clumsy and tremble too much for that. All of our knowledge and efforts must be thrust into the market, into the modern system of living, so that we simply cannot use any to explore our innermost selves. Even as I type this, the idea of exploring what it means to be alive comes to me as so bizarrely abstract. It is like a distant shout from the outside, barely discernible, more likely attributed to the woes of some events on the street and far easier to simply ignore than examine. In this way, we are pushed to not only ignorance of our existence, but to the ignorance of this ignorance. We just don't know any better. In battle against all of this, Thoreau stripped life back to its most bare essentials. At Walden Pond, he sought to live deliberately. This was to lead life with intention, to arrive at conclusions and judgments independently, and to do things on purpose by your own choosing. Thoreau spent his time at Walden largely in solitude. This word should not be taken to mean just being alone. It is rather to be with. It is a very active engagement with the world around oneself. Thoreau noted that he, in fact, at Walden, quote, had a great deal of company in his house. He said that on his land he had the company of an old settler, of the man who had first dug his home at Walden Pond. He had the company, too, of an invisible old woman who he described as owning a wondrously fragrant herb garden. This woman, Thoreau said, told, quote, the original of every fable and that on which everyone is founded. So Thoreau in his solitude is very much not alone. The past, the present, and the future were all in society at Walden, pouring out in the natural world around him. Thoreau's solitude was not indicated by miles of space, but rather a nearness to himself and to the very fibers of the world, an appreciation for those things which formed and existed infinitely in nature. Solitude can help us break free from unintentional living. When removed from society, a person is too removed from the distractions it presents. While social dynamics are important for social life, they often override things which otherwise would allow us to flourish. In the developed world, we are ostracized, misunderstood, or admonished for not embracing societal norms. And so society at large encourages and even requires oppressive conformity. Solitude frees us from these norms and values which we have passively accepted. It removes the barriers which prohibit us from truly knowing ourselves. When we are not bound by these constructs, we can better find what we individually, authentically, and truly believe to be important. Of course, Thoreau's writing is not so simple, and its context also deserves attention. Thoreau does not declare that all of humankind should return to some primitive pre-industrial society. Indeed, while at Walden, Thoreau wasn't entirely cut off from the world. He recounts dinners with friends, trips to town, and occasional meetings with townspeople. Some people have said this invalidates all that he wrote. I disagree. Walden was not created as a man against nature tale. In the book, which is basically a diary, Thoreau never proclaims himself as being entirely self-sufficient or living off the land. Instead, it is the desire to simplify life that is the driving force behind Walden. It is less of a physical self-reliance that Walden espouses, but instead a spiritual self-reliance. Walden is not an outright rejection of modern society, but a quest to better know oneself so that we can discover which parts of society we are suited to. After all, Thoreau himself went quite happily and even ambitiously back to the civilized world after leaving Walden Pond. Thoreau's idea was not that everyone should follow his lead. Walden was not a guidebook for living nor a copyable roadmap for happiness, as much as it pains me to admit. Instead, it was an exaltation to find your own Walden Pond. In the book, Thoreau writes, "I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account. I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, not his father's, or his mother's, or his neighbor's instead." There's a school of thought today that happiness is not a cabin in the forest, that to propose this concept or anything near it is a suggestion of cowardice, that retreat to nature represents some misguided version of running from your problems. Thoreau did not run from his problems, and neither should we. Quite the opposite, we should follow his example and run to our problems. In solitude, we are closest to ourselves and we can confront all that we know. We can sort the important from the unimportant. We can understand the world around us in ways completely impossible within the confines of systems and social dynamics. In solitude, all we have is our problems. Certainly, this worked pretty well for Henry David Thoreau. As he was dying at just 44 years old, Thoreau said, "I suppose that I have not many months to live, but of course, I know nothing about it. I may add that I am enjoying existence as much as ever, and regret nothing." In the private sense, I think Thoreau's insights are invaluable. Taking individual action can radically transform one's life. But Thoreau's meditations represent a conflict of humanity versus itself. Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher who has emerged as a rightfully divisive figure. We can discuss that momentarily. For now, we will focus on an essay he wrote called The Question Concerning Technology. Here we must first define technology. Heidegger does not say technology to mean just electrics, computers, or circuitry, but instead it is any object or system which forces the manipulation of the natural world. A factory is technology, a road is technology, a business is itself technology. In his essay, Heidegger investigates what he calls the essence of technology. The essence of technology is that which it truly is. A tree can have green leaves and brown bark, but that doesn't make it a tree. Plenty of trees do not have these things. So what makes a tree a tree? Likewise, Heidegger says we must find what technology truly is, aside from its various configurations and incarnations. Heidegger argues that in this conversation, humans have a fundamental misunderstanding. People generally believe that technology is two things: an instrument of human activity and a means to an end. But neither of these have proven to be true in practice. Technology is not an instrument, it is not a tool that humanity wields. If all technology fails tomorrow, humanity would very likely collapse. This is just not how a tool works. Rather, technology is a condition, an event in which humanity exists. And because of this event, we have rearranged our entire world. A tree is no longer a tree, but a resource. It is a thing we can use to fuel technology, to create books and newspapers and timber and houses. Metals found within the earth are no longer metals, they are too a resource. The same can be said for any naturally occurring material on earth. Today, the question always seems to be, what is this used for? Not what is this? So these natural things now exist, like Heidegger says, as part of a global supply closet. This doesn't stop at plants or animals. It extends to humans. You yourself are a resource for technology. The market does not see you as a human with thoughts or feelings or imagination or much of anything besides the potential to fuel some other piece of technology. Within the modern marketplace, your utility is to be some part of a supply chain, a resource, no different than trees or rare earth metals. So like Thoreau also suggested, technology pulls us farther and farther from reality. We ourselves are distorted into resources, surrounded by these other resources. In this way, technological progress sentences us to ignorance. Aside from being fuel for some technology, we don't know what we really are. This is a whirlpool, a spiral that goes on and on. When repeated across generations, we don't just not know what it means to be human, but we entirely forget that there is even a concept of being human outside of existence as a resource. So again, we become ignorant of our own ignorance. Technology is not really a means to an end either. It is not a wire that eventually turns on some light bulb. No, it is a circuit, a closed loop. I have found this demonstrated explicitly in the confines of the city. When the American city was constructed, it was done so along a rational, quantifiable set of data. The city will provide an economic boon to the country, perhaps even the world. In the city, we will produce more money, more buildings, and more people. The city is progress. But like Thoreau and Heidegger would have suggested, that progress is not free. The city demands things of its residents. The city needs people to work and create its material and its economic output. So civilians are bossed around and bullied throughout the metropolitan area, not necessarily by any individual, but instead by the city itself. The city demands, put aside what dreams or plans you have for your days. The market needs you. Progress needs you. You must wake up at 7 a.m. because the train comes at 8 a.m. and you must be at the station when the city says, because the shop must open, because people must buy things and pay taxes and produce market prosperity for the city. In a circular sort of conclusion, your reward for doing as the city dictates is continued employment. You must keep catching the 8 a.m. train. On the other hand, there is the man dying in the subway with his rotting leg. At some point in his past, he could not catch the 8 a.m. train, and so the city has no reason now to help him catch that 8 a.m. train. Ultimately, for as much opportunity as cities promise, they are quite effective traps. Such is the nature of technological progress. We drill for oil to build more things, but now we have more things, so we must drill for more oil. The factory worker builds wrenches which are used to maintain that same factory. The robot builds robots. Progress produces itself, but then requires itself, and so it must consume itself again and again. Today, we are so dependent on technology that we cannot really let this loop stop. So we dedicate ourselves as resources to keep it going. But in doing so, we have relinquished control of the circuit. We cannot turn it on and off. We are now just in the circuit. Any conversation of Heidegger should and will include one thing. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party. A year later, he resigned and later called the decision to join the greatest stupidity of his life. Today, discussions surrounding Heidegger often ignore his ideas and instead focus on this decision and its implications on his work. Academics comb through this topic hundreds of times per year, aimlessly and without any unique purpose or conclusion. And so Heidegger's work has likewise been transmuted into a resource. Not for grappling with technology or changing human direction, but instead a resource for bloated, industrialized, ostensibly free market academia. And so we will not engage in that road. We will just say that Heidegger's work must be approached with caution in two directions. Caution that we consider it within its context, and caution that we do not ignore it because of this context. As the years go by and as progress continues, I tend to think his writings have only become increasingly relevant. There has been a rigor of scientific studies that show higher incidences of mental anguish within metropolitan cities rather than more rural areas. Mental illnesses have also risen alongside industrialized society and our collective obsession with technological progress. If these correlations are significant in a determining way, I don't really know. That is a conclusion to be reached by more qualified individuals. I can only say that I have reached other conclusions. Capitalism, or whatever version of it we live under now, pits the private economy against the public economy. Your choices, food, shelter, clothing, hobbies, are dictated by the needs of the market and your capability within it. Collective action is important and public reform is most desirable. But it would be a great tragedy to spend one's entire life working for a better world while one's own backyard remains a mess. I think that a retreat, partial or entire, from metropolitan life multiplies our possibilities within the capitalist landscape. This withdrawal allows us to become more free of the world's impositions and the market's desires. In doing so, our eyes are open to new modalities of life, new forms of happiness, which are not based on the arbitrary judgments or clumsy feelings of other people. There's some great irony in all of this, which is not lost on me. I sit here, writing this, perched on the glamorous, forwardmost part of human technological achievement, the internet, the computer. How can I reconcile this massive inconsistency? My honest answer is that I don't really have an answer. I don't know everything, and this is one of the many things that I do not know. All that I can do, maybe all that I want to do, is express myself, try to improve myself within the world as it exists, and have some hope that I will come out better for the effort. If we feel hopeless, as I often do within this storm of modernity, we can again examine a Thoreauvian approach. Hope is something that comes from within, and it can resist oppressive forces around us. If we are strong enough, it may also be something permanent. In Walden, Thoreau wrote that we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. Modern life has lulled us into a sleep with its material demands, money, houses, cars, power. But we should keep hope. Always have hope. No matter how hard we lean on material pleasures, how deeply we sleep in this way, we should always know that we can one day wake up, and that the dawn will be there, waiting just for us.
Morning comes and you wake. Your first awareness is of boundless misery. You long for some kind of caffeinated beverage so you can be miserable faster. You exit your place of dwelling and enter the beverage establishment a few streets down. Coffee please, you say to the barista. Milk or no milk, they ask. Milk please, you say. Colombian or Brazilian beans? Colombian, you say? It really doesn't matter. Northern or Southern Colombia? Really? I don't mind. I don't mind. Good choice. Now, beans that grow at 3,000 or 4,000 feet? What difference does... I don't care. I don't care. Well, there are at least 15,000 growers in that region. I really don't mind. Would you prefer your grower likes or dislikes rappers whose names begin with the prefix Lil? What? Lil Pump, for example. What? I don't give a shit. Lil Yachty, Lil Uzi Vert, Lil Chair, Lil Table, Lil Dachshund, Lil Harpsichord, Lil Tokamak Nuclear Fusion Reactor. Well, Buddhists believe that is the human condition. Sort of. A perpetual cycle of chasing after contentment and ultimately receiving only dissatisfaction. This dissatisfaction is called dukkha, and this game of rebirthing over and over into dissatisfaction happens in samsara, which is where we live, apparently. And the idea is we stay in samsara, living, learning, dying, being reborn, until we hopefully attain enlightenment. But what's enlightenment? How is wisdom achieved? What in the sweet bejesus is going on with giraffes' tongues? No, but seriously, look at that. And that. And just... and that. It's been Siddhartha Gautama, who you will shortly recognize from his stage name, the Buddha. We begin in Nepal about 2,500 years ago. Siddhartha Gautama is born into a cushy royal family, and trying to be nice, Siddhartha's dad shields him from the nasty things in life and keeps him in a massive palace. Until, at 29 years old, on a rare jaunt outside the palace, Siddhartha notices people who are like way sick and like way old and like way dead, and realizes, as my climber friends insist on informing me, the universe is a pretty gnarly place, bro. So, soon after, he leaves his kingdom and sets off in search of a way to rid the world of suffering. It's a long story, but finally Siddhartha sits under a tree, determining that he will not get up again until he has realized the true nature of mind. The demon Mara approaches him and tries to lure Siddhartha away from enlightenment with distraction and lust, but Siddhartha is like, I'm busy, cheers, and indeed becomes enlightened and attains nirvana. Nirvana literally meaning to blow out, to extinguish. We'll get to it in a bit, but it was then that Siddhartha became the Buddha, or literally the awakened one, because he was now free of the three great poisons: delusion, greed, and hate. So one would imagine he was, as my climber friends like to say, pretty stoked, bro. And on your marks, get set, Buddhism, a world religion, is born. Oh yeah, the slightly tubby smiling guy you might have seen little statuettes of? Yeah, that's probably not the Buddha, but Budai, a 10th century monk. He's also thought by some to be Maitreya. Who's Maitreya? Okay, this gets wiggly. So Buddhist philosophy is kinda out there, man. And while Buddhists don't really have a creation myth, the universe wasn't spoken or sneezed into being, they do have some fairly trippy ideas about time. Often in Buddhism and Hinduism, cosmic duration is divided into eras called kalpas. When asked how long one type of kalpa was, the Buddha allegedly said the length of time it would take to reduce a mountain 16 by 16 by 16 miles to the size of a seed if you rubbed it with a silk cloth once a century. So a while. Now, in some interpretations, Siddhartha Gautama wasn't the first Buddha to turn up. There have apparently been a bunch before and will apparently be a bunch after, and the next Buddha to turn up in our current era, in our current kalpa, ages from now, is supposed to be Maitreya, represented here, and possibly represented here also by this gentleman. And that's who the little tubby man is, so yeah. After about 45 years of teaching, the Buddha died in 483 BCE. We'll just jump ahead a bit because I'm bored, and 2 millennia later and Buddhism has fractured into a bunch of different schools. One is Tibetan Buddhism, and this next cheerful bald gentleman is of course the current Dalai Lama. It's tempting to think of the Dalai Lama as the Pope of Buddhism, and kinda, but the real Pope isn't the head of Christianity, just the Catholic Church, and the Dalai Lama isn't the head of Buddhism, he's the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism. Dalai Lamas aren't elected, they're found. When a Dalai Lama dies, the High Lamas leave it a while, then go looking for the child the deceased Dalai Lama has apparently reincarnated as. Then, once confirmed, the child is taken off to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, to begin the process of learning to become the Dalai Lama again. The first Dalai Lama was born about 700 years ago and rose from a poor child born in a cattle pen to become one of the most respected teachers in Central Asia, and is rumored to have attained Buddhahood, then did a spot of the old dying. Then came Dalai Lama II, Electric Buddhaloo. At the age of 4, a child in the Tsang region of Tibet declares, "Mum, Dad, I am in fact the Dalai Lama and I'd like to see my monks again," and is confirmed as the first reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. He has a good run and dies in meditation at the age of 67. His reincarnation is found just a few years later, and so on, up until the 6th Dalai Lama. So this is a weird one. Due to events too finicky to go into, the 6th incarnation was recognized as the Dalai Lama a bit late, around the age of 15. A few years later though, when it got time to take his full vows, he refused, and it was not uncommon to see him staggering drunk around Lhasa and visiting brothels for some scripture and chill, maybe. He also wrote some romantic and kinda sometimes kinky poetry. "If I could meditate as deeply on the sacred texts as I do on you, I would clearly be enlightened in this lifetime. As in, school is cool, but baby, for you, I got it bad." As we discussed, Tibetan Buddhism is just one branch of many, but across all the various schools of Buddhism, Mahayana, Theravada, and so on, there are some pillars that are just universally agreed upon. To begin with, there are the 4 noble truths, which are 1. Existing is a bit crap, namely full of dukkha, dissatisfaction. To be is to want. To want is to eventually be dissatisfied. We grasp for things, monies, funnies, feline tummies. Sometimes we get them, then we just keep grasping for more. 2. The cause of suffering is craving. Wanting is the problem, Buddhists claim. Nothing, not mansions, not games that aren't buggy on release, can ever be so satisfying they kill desire. Desire is the problem because it never ends. 3. The end of suffering comes with the end of desire, the end of grasping, the end of craving. The way out of the forest of suffering is not to pound down cheeseburgers and gold leaf vodka until every desire is gone, but to extinguish the flame of desire itself. To quote a famous line, "Let go or be dragged." And finally, 4. Everything will apparently be alright if you follow the Eightfold Path, which is basically CrossFit for Buddhists, and if I can think of any theologically appropriate jokes, maybe we'll get to it, but time is short and I'm an alcoholic, not an educator. And while we're at it, how about we do the 3 marks of existence, the 3 constants of being alive. The first mark of existence is dukkha, dissatisfaction. But we've done this one already, and I hope you're listening because there will be a test at the end. The second is anicca or anicca, basically impermanence. Reality, according to Buddhism, is a transient, ever-changing thing. Oh, you might reply, such a revelation, much deep. What next? Fire is hot, blobfish are gross. Well, actually, blobfish aren't gross, incidentally. Thank you. If you keep seeing this image around, that's a blobfish when it's pulled out of the water. Normally, blobfish prefer to stay at between 2,000 and 4,000 feet in the ocean where they look like reasonable fish. They look like that because we yank them out of the water. And it's one thing that we have the audacity to trawl them out of the ocean in the first place, but it's quite another to malign their appearance by pretending that's what they actually look like, because they don't. Much like if a huge hook came down and pulled one of us into space, and aliens just sat around chuckling at our vacuum-frozen, nitrogen-swollen corpses going, "Well, humans aren't very pretty after all." Anyway, chaps, how about an antimatter brewski? Stop it! Leave blobfish alone. Excuse me. Reality, to our Buddhist friends, is a formless swirling dance of is. From the entropic decaying galaxies to the tide-eroded rocks of the beach. All is flux, all is change, and you will die. But so will I, so it's alright. Our inability to accept anicca, to accept that everything is impermanent, is apparently a large source of our dukkha, of our suffering. And because we refuse to accept change, we cling to illusions of permanence. We cling to the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and to the fleeting forms of the world. And on that note, let me tell you what a pleasure it is to live in one's 3rd decade of life, when you can still enjoy not just the persistent facial acne you thought would go away over a decade ago, but at the very same time begin to notice grey hairs popping up and say hi, while you stare at yourself helplessly in the bathroom mirror feeling 19 again and simultaneously 99. The 3rd mark of existence is called anatta, and it's, well, you know, months ago I came down with a cheeky spot of the old you-know-what virus. I'm fine, thanks for not asking. And trapped indoors for weeks and almost terminally bored, I became quite massively addicted to a game called Town of Salem, which no one is paying me to tell you about, I just kinda liked it. So, very briefly, you're assigned a random role at the beginning of the game. You might be a member of the town, as in the goodies, or the baddies, the witch, for example. Basically the card game mafia! Anyway, you don't have to play long before you start noticing that whenever you're assigned as a goodie, you sort of automatically hate the evil players for being so deceptive. And then again, when you're evil, you can't stand all those life-affirming do-gooder morons. And you start to have this creeping suspicion that quite a lot of what goes on in our gelatinous meat computers is kind of context dependent. Because just as in the game, in life we're assigned roles we have to play, of course. Student, employee, spouse, scripted pretentious know-it-all online, etc. And like in the game, sometimes it's hard to tell where the roles stop and our genuine personalities begin. And the Buddhist answer to this is that it's not just the world that's impermanent, but ourselves in it. Our outer identities are shifting all the time, of course, and that's just the external stuff. On the inside of our minds, it's even more mental. In watching the interior of one's own mind, it's all sense data and thoughts, irate, happy, bored, excited, whatever. But in not one of those sensations or thoughts will one find an I, a me. Obviously, something is doing the experiencing, but it doesn't appear to have a middle we can grasp or catch sight of. To bastardize a famous Buddhist story, if someone asked you to show them a plane, and you did, the ailerons and the rudder and the engines, and they said, yes, but where's the plane though? You'd think that person was a few fries short of a Happy Meal, because a plane is just the sum of its parts. It's a bit like that with us, our Buddhist friends say. There is no amount of clinging to our names, to our careers, to the constant white noise of nonsense thoughts inside by which we will catch sight of a tangible me, of an I. And that, in a very botched way, is the third mark of existence, anatta. We're clearly conscious, but our consciousness in Buddhism doesn't have a center, not in time, not in mental space. Our mental selves are constantly in flux, ever-changing, ever-impermanent. There is a bit of a similar sentiment in the sciencey cosmological tradition that we are star stuff, that underneath the complex recursive storytelling machinery of our brains, I am X years old, I am X feet high in X century, I am I. Beneath those stories there is biology, and beneath that is chemistry, and beneath that is a unity of physics and deep time that everything is made from. We were once these, then these, in a while we will be these, but we were always this and will always be this. The idea is that our identities are incidental, and clinging to them over the majesty of the universe is wicked silly. There is no magical line between baby and us now that we can point to and say, and then I became me. It isn't so much that we can't step in the same river twice, but with the entire world in flux, with us in flux, it's that we can't even step in the same river once. In the Dhammapada, the sayings of the Buddha, there's the line, though one may conquer 1,000 times 1,000 men in battle, yet he indeed is the noblest victor who conquers himself. Or herself, obviously. Mastery of the self. It's a neat idea, and boy do we seem a long way off from that one. Just daily life is weird enough. Bound without security, lost without adventure, wandering quietly confused for years through the strange cityscapes of the 21st century, trying to find yourself in it, in any of it, trying to find the naive happiness of childhood once again. And is this what life is now, you think? Little bursts of euphoria a few times a year, drug-induced or chance-induced, then back to the uniform grey of a day you won't remember. And if you should ever stick your head up above the parapet to ask, "Excuse me, is this all there is?" then only to be told to shut up and just get on with it. All the while knowing that a star died to make you and you no longer find romance in that. All the while being surrounded by miraculous technology and you no longer find romance in that. The absurd ever-drama of just trying to be okay. And the game gets faster, and the game gets harder, more gadgets, more screens, more patches, and non-stick frying pans, and fiber broadband, and ultrasonic fucking toothbrushes. And thank you for your application, and sorry to hear you're feeling sad, and we did everything we could, but please God make me a stone. I promised myself I'd be more than this. I promised others I'd be more than this. Alive and not quite living, deathly not quite